And thank you so much for joining me for a virtual coffee with the editor. COVID-19, the impact on infrastructure projects globally and obviously in Africa. What are your thoughts?
At the moment, it's very early in the piece. The only thing that's certain is that there is a huge variety of opinions going around as to what the impact is going to be over in the immediate term, in the short term, and in the medium term. So, from what we're seeing, obviously some of the larger extractives projects have been put on hold. Those that were supposed to reach FID in the next couple of months have been shifted back by about 6 months, particularly in the energy space. And that does have knock-on effects on other project activities, support infrastructure, ancillary infrastructure, and so on. So there is that immediate impact. Companies that produce minerals and metals that are used in the construction space and in the built environment, we've seen a couple of those projects being scaled back because of lower demand in Asia and in particular in China. So I think there is that immediate impact on development in general, but also from an infrastructure perspective. Obviously, companies that are building infrastructure have to comply with the legislation of the countries that they're in. So if there is a general lockdown, it does have an impact on new infrastructure build in terms of being able to mobilize crews and your technical staff in a way that complies with lockdown, being able to get the correct permits. Is your build considered to be strategic or critical? With a lot of countries, obviously your ongoing maintenance and running of key infrastructure has to continue, whether it's ports or rail or airports or power and so on, water and sanitation. So you do have that ongoing activity that still takes place. But in many countries, you are seeing disruption of new infrastructure activity.
So if we took the construction sector specifically, and certainly in South Africa, we were hoping that 2020 would see a turnaround. Do you think that we still might, or is 2020 over and we'll start again next year?
I think that in South Africa specifically, we'll struggle to turn things around this year with the current levels of commitment that government has to make a meaningful impact in the sector. We're talking about a few $1 billion here or there, which if you look at what other countries are stumping up is really, really not very much. And a lot of the money that our government is looking at the moment is really in emergency support for companies, particularly in small and medium-sized enterprises, which obviously is critical, but we're not seeing the kind of announcements yet in terms of stimulus packages that would really push some buttons in terms of the construction sector in South Africa.
And in Africa, what are you seeing? I mean, I know from the Africa House email that you sent out this morning, you were talking about putting together an actual document that was kind of documenting what each of the countries were doing in terms of their response. I mean, that in itself sounds like a good idea and good resource to have at one's fingertips. But what are you seeing unrolling or unfolding in our neighboring countries?
Well, I think if you look at it, the matrix that we're putting together, it looks across a number of different areas in terms of which countries are in lockdown, what the regulations are, travel, access to ports or airports or road transport and so on. But then also the response of the governments themselves, which in most instances is very constrained in terms of fiscal responses that they can have, but what they're doing in terms of unlocking donor support. And I think this is really important because just one example, the World Bank has already committed to rolling out about $160 billion over the next 15 months in support of developing countries around the world. Many of those will be in Africa. There are already 11 countries in Africa that have got emergency funding from the World Bank to tackle the immediate medical needs of the corona pandemic. So I think in many respects, possibly other countries in the region that are used to pandemics or crises more than we are in South Africa, and that are more in tune with what the development finance institutions can offer, will probably be better placed to unlock some of that funding than we are. Just if you look in our media, we seem to be constrained by ideological debates around the Bretton Woods institutions rather than what the financial assistance is that they can offer us. So I think in terms of the rest of the region, there is still some activity happening. It's not as if everything has collapsed. And I think the important thing for me is that if you juxtapose the current situation where we're talking about drops in commodity prices, obviously most obvious with the oil price, but also things like copper, cobalt, graphite, iron ore, aluminium, that kind of thing, where a lot of the ratings agencies believe that the prices will be constrained for at least the next 18 months. I think you have to overlay that with the fact that the G20 between them are going to put about $5 trillion into their economies. And obviously that money a lot of that money will stimulate demand for basic materials and exports from Africa. So I am a little bit more optimistic in that I think it's not going to be a V-shaped rebound, but it's not going to be as negative perhaps as some people or some institutions are making it out to be. So I think that even though things are looking pretty dire for some of our neighbors, in general, in Southern and East Africa in particular, there could be quite a quick rebound in some of the more proactive markets. And I think that really is where you have to look, is not try and look at Africa as one entity, but look at each country and its merits and what they're doing and what it is that they are trying to unlock in terms of getting their economies back on track once lockdown is over.
Yeah, so I am in agreement with you, and I have been quite betwixt and between, for want of a better word, to go, is the picture really that bleak? Because there are projects that have come to a complete standstill, and certainly from my perspective in the rail arena. But in the same breath, I'm looking like more closely here at home in South Africa, and I'm going, well, we've just been downgraded. We weren't doing very well to begin with. And, even our markets are looking at our neighbors, in terms of expanding their businesses. So on the one hand, I'm going, oh my goodness, it's very bleak. And on the other hand, I'm going, there's quite a lot of opportunity.
Yes, I think there is. If you look at the LNG projects in Mozambique, whilst the Area 4 FID has been put on ice for the time being, the Area 1 project is continuing. It's continuing obviously at a slower pace, simply because of the physical disruptions of getting crews on site and getting products to site. But it continues. The very large copper projects in the DR Congo are continuing. The biggest problem for some of those is the actual logistics of those projects. So, for instance, the border at Kasumbalesa between Zambia and the DRC, the queues of the trucks are apparently up to 90 kilometers long. So from that perspective, some of the projects that we're looking at are being constrained not so much by the developers not wanting them to go ahead, but simply by the actual logistics of trying to get projects going and also to bring your materials in. In Kenya, for instance, the cost of building materials has risen by between 5 and 10%. If you're having to factor in an extra 10% in your build, it becomes problematic if you're running a $2 or $3 billion project. And that's the kind of of disruption that there is. In terms of opportunity, I suppose the race really is on to see who can supply into those projects and those opportunities first. Whether we're able to, in South Africa, to mobilize and to be able to get product into other markets, particularly on the eastern side of the continent, quicker than the Chinese are able to remobilize and get stuff back. Although in many respects, exports from China, but particularly into a country like Mozambique, haven't really suffered that much. So it really is a question of positioning yourself when things start to normalize, and even before that, to ensure that you're in a good position to be able to supply into projects, whether they are extractives or whether it's into infrastructure development and build.
Are you of the opinion that our new normal will be slightly different to what we have become accustomed to?
Yes, I am. I think, and again, at the risk of being accused of taking a slightly Pollyanna-ish view of the world, I think that one of the things that countries in Africa will be able to do is accelerate regional supply and domestic supply. And that's of both goods and services. If you look at particular things like the oil industry, countries, almost all of them have very strong local content programs. And I think they will use this to try and push those even further and to get a lot more domestic supply into those projects. So I think from that perspective, companies that have very strong footprints in the region will probably find they are better off over the next 6 months to 18 months as the world reorganizes itself. I think that the world as it is will start to move towards having more options in terms of supply chains. You don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. And I think that that's something that's going to start to filter through. I think just from a technology perspective, with most of the world now sitting at home and working from home, the flexibility of not necessarily having to fly people to site every time you want to have a meeting will become one of the things that we just get used to, that we will be doing more remote business. And that obviously has a number of impacts, whether it be on the travel and tourism sector, but certainly from streamlining of business operations, it probably is going to make companies a little bit more efficient and effective. So I think there are opportunities to be had. I think companies that have a well-established footprint across the continent, and possibly even looking as far as local assembly, local manufacture, will find that as the world is going to have more and more of these disruptions, whether it be climatic, whether it be these kinds of disruptions, viruses, or whether it's the trade wars and the oil wars and that kind of thing. I do think we're heading down that path of more, not fewer global disruptions. And if you are well positioned in key markets to overcome those, I think you are going to prosper, as opposed to companies that take a more conservative stance.
All right, so let's close out on your thoughts in terms of the railway sector.
Rail is a sector that has been very difficult in Africa over the last sort of 20 odd years or 30 years to unlock the value of, because of competition from road transport predominantly, and the lack of volumes to make most railways profitable. I think the scenario has changed, and whilst there might be some immediate disruption to rail projects and rail and port developments in particular, my sense is that once we all emerge from this and business does start to pick up again, that the underlying value of those projects then comes back into play. So I don't see that the sector over the longer term will suffer. There will obviously be the short-term disruptions, as there are to all businesses, but certainly over the next couple of years, I expect most of the viable rail projects will pick up once more. You might find a couple that were marginal may take longer to get themselves back on track. I think one more advantage rail possibly has in situations like this is that rather than having 1,000 trucks going cross-border with at least 1,000 drivers, possibly 2,000 drivers, you have one rail carrier, and you really do minimize the threat of transmission of viruses and so on. So perhaps it could actually be a stimulus to look at rail as an alternative to road transport for cargoes that you can transport and have minimal human interaction to lessen the impact of issues like coronavirus.
Duncan, Africa House, you guys are obviously still operational and still consulting for your clients during this time?
Yes, absolutely. We're obviously working remotely, but we're still pushing out projects, and we're still doing what we can to keep our clients at the forefront of what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think it is absolutely critical that companies look at the opportunities in the region, so that as soon as things start to normalize, they're able to take advantage of them. So we're still working flat out.
Fantastic. Duncan, thank you very much for your time. It was informative, and I'm sure my listeners will enjoy it.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks, Philippa.